Hey everybody, it's Professor Wess member of the Sine Institute fellow, and welcome to installment number three of our Institute of Policy and Politics seminar. And this one is really going to be one that I've been looking forward to a while, and is very special and very near and dear to my heart, because today we're really going to be focusing on the idea of pushing philanthropy out of its comfort zones. I'm thrilled to be joined by my friend Connie Chang from the Lever Fund. But before we bring her on board, I just wanted to first again say thank you to the entire team, to PJ and to Fritz and everybody at American who really worked hard to help pull all this together. And thank you for this conversation in particular. I think about this in context, and I think about the whole world and role of philanthropy in the idea that I run a philanthropic organization, right? I run a foundation that for the past 32 years has focused exclusively on ending poverty within our geography, and I'll talk a little bit about the relationship we also have with the Lever Fund, with the Lever Fund. But the reality is that I very much find myself as a non-traditional leader in the philanthropic space. When I first became the CEO of Robinhood, now a little over 4 years ago, I remember when they first started having conversations with me in the search process, and mentioning, "Hey, we'd like to talk to you about becoming the CEO of Robinhood." And I remember initially getting my thoughts and thinking to myself, I don't know why they're having this conversation with me, because I've never been in philanthropy before. I've never served in philanthropy. I didn't rise up through the ranks of other philanthropic organizations. And so why are they having the conversations with me? In fact, I told them, I said, if anything, I've been pretty critical of philanthropy. In fact, the person who was leading the search committee at that time, who then became my board chair, and now is a good friend, he said, no, we know, we've done our diligence and we've seen it, and it's all over the internet. And I said, then if you've seen me being critical of philanthropy, then why are we having this conversation? And his response back to me, and I won't forget his response back, he's like, because we think that many of the challenges that you made are actually right. And this is about how can we push philanthropy out of its comfort zone? How do we understand the real power of philanthropy? What is it that philanthropy can do, and how philanthropy can actually add a unique value into the value proposition of our society if it so chooses? Because some people can look at philanthropy and think that this is about, like a risk capital, a needle moving, innovative ideas, focusing on economic mobility. Some look at it as something that focuses on very human pain, and how do you address the issues or the people that historically have fallen through. Some people might look at it as simply a tax break and something that we receive an IRS benefit. But knowing that all of these mechanisms, while all of them have the chance to be true, all of them have the chance to be better. And I think about that in context when you think about the larger, frame of exactly, of exactly where we are. where we have this idea and this idea that philanthropy can play this role of filling everything, of fixing everything. And the reality is that that's also just fundamentally not true. I mean, we're going to go into a little later on about what some of the limitations, potential limitations of philanthropy are. But it also is highlighting the fact that what philanthropy can also help to uniquely do is to shine a light on what is wrong, and to shine a light on the things that we know we have to do a better job of being able to address and fix. We play the role in the space of philanthropy at Robinhood, for example, of focusing on economic mobility, right? Of providing methods and mechanisms for sustainable economic mobility for for families, for communities. But the reality is this, and there's actually a quote that sits on my desk from Dr. King. And that quote actually reads, "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropists to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary." Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary. So tonight, I want us to talk a little bit about that. I want us to talk a little bit about the history of philanthropy. I want us to talk about not just the impacts that philanthropy has had, but also oftentimes how philanthropy has also been used as simply a tax code benefit for the wealthy. I want to talk about how people can think about philanthropy, and when we think about philanthropy and philanthropic giving and nonprofit organizations, that there's a wide variety of nonprofit organizations who we are talking about, to include places like universities, and how those mechanisms are then pushed, pulled, prodded, and triggered can have a distinct impact on the type of society that we will then live in, on that large society that we are then building. And so along those lines, we talk about how, when people think about philanthropy, the reality is philanthropy is actually as old a mechanism in the American capital system as anything else. Philanthropy had its earliest beginnings in the 16th century, where this was a period where philanthropy was exercised via religion, and beginning of the individualistic voluntary philanthropy. So you had Native Americans who were practicing long-standing philanthropic traditions. You had Anthony Bezonet, who founded the African School for enslaved peoples that were brought over. So you had this idea of people who were then saying, how can we use capital to be able to either fulfill a very human pulling and pressing, or what they felt was a very instinctual need that then is designed within. That then translates into the 1830s and 1865, where you saw that was the period of the creation of a secular nonprofit sector, right? A sector where you actually had quote unquote nonprofit organizations that were then doing much of the social work within society, doing much of the social building and so much of the societal framework building from this new industry, this new thing that was then known as the nonprofit sector, the separation of church and state that sparks private philanthropy. This was kind of this era of a birth of this new type of industry where you said you can have a private sector and you can have a government, but what's that thing that sits here? And that was really the birth of this sector. Also during that period, you had, philanthropic efforts that were led up to and past the Civil War. You had de Tocqueville, who publishes The Democracy in America. Harriet Tubman, who was leading the Underground Railroad. Congress creates the Freedmen's Bureau. All this during that period that you then had all these various mechanisms that were being built and pushed during that time. And then from there is when people saw from 1865 to call it 1925, 1930. That's when the Mount Rushmore of the philanthropists of philanthropy really began to build. The rise in many ways of what we all now know as philanthropy. The influential individualistic philanthropy that took place during that Gilded Age. That's when Andrew Carnegie pens The Gospel of Wealth in the late 19th century, where John Rockefeller charters a foundation and Carnegie established the Carnegie Corporation, the rise of individual giving that coincided with a larger era of tax reforms leading to individual organizations, charitable deductions, and that's when we then leads to up to 1936 when the introduction of the Corporation Tax Reduction for Charitable Contributions Act was passed, where we started watching tax changes in the tax code that then looked at and focused on the way people focused on philanthropy. We saw how in 1965 into around the era of about 3 decades ago, you saw things like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They fund R&D for 911 emergency response system. How philanthropy then became the R&D mechanism for many of societal benefits. You saw how whether it was how Robin Hood and organizations like mine really focus on focusing on supporting families and supporting entities after 9/11. You saw foundations taking on a new and a crucial and a leading role when it came to the basics of saying, are we here to alleviate a problem or are we here to solve one? Up until even recently, where you saw how collections of billionaires who are signing the Giving Pledge. Philanthropy has gone through multiple levels of ebbs and flows all throughout our societal build out. We've seen how some of the greatest innovations that we have within our society were things that were triggered and pulled by philanthropy. We saw how philanthropy also has not moved fast enough when it came to responding and pushing and pulling on the mechanisms of why these problems exist in the first place. Thinking that simply philanthropic gifts were going to be enough to address structural pains. And so as we come now to this place, we come now to this new era of philanthropy. This new time when philanthropy and philanthropists and those of us who are running organizations are really actually being tested in different ways. Where the idea of the person who just simply says, well, because they are the philanthropist, they are the hero in the story, that isn't necessarily believed. That myth isn't necessarily trumpeted. But truly understanding that to provide measures of sustainable economic support, sustainable moral support, that means every single industry and every single phase within our society takes on a collective role of responsibility to push harder and to do better. Before I want to bring Connie to this conversation, I think that there's two important things that we have to remember about philanthropy in this moment. And I think we saw it when it came to this past year. One was that philanthropy has a distinct role in being able to highlight and understand the role that all of the isms do play within our society. Whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, or whether it's things like xenophobia and homophobia. That we have to understand the role and the power of philanthropy in order to address many of those larger problems that we are then trying to address and trying to fix. The second piece, though, is the significance of understanding the power of philanthropy, but also its limitations. Every single year, on average, we will have around $700 billion that goes out every year towards philanthropy. And people say, well, I didn't realize it was that much money. That's a really big dollar. That's a really big amount. And it is a very big amount, right? $700 billion, more or less, is a significant number. And people say you can solve a lot of the world's problems with that, and that's true. But here's the challenge. Of that $700 billion, about half of that goes to colleges and universities, endowments. Hence one of the reasons why, for example, Harvard University, where their $37 billion endowment So you take that 700 billion, and that now has just gone down to 350 billion. And people say, well, that's still a lot of money, and that is still a lot of money. But half of that goes towards homes of worship and hospitals. So now you're down to about 175 for everything else, for animals, for the environment, for poverty, for racial justice, for seniors, for early childhood, everything. So there is a distinct power that philanthropy can take on, but that power must be coupled with a distinct humility. That philanthropy must both learn to share its power, but also philanthropy must also be prepared to exercise levers of power that go well beyond just how we give grants and who we give grants to. That without justice, you cannot have equity. And that philanthropy must move and act intentionally in all of this. And when I think about people who I admire in this space, people who every time I'm around them, they just force me to think harder. They force me to push harder. They force me to try different things. One of the people who I admire most within this space is a person who I'm honored to have as a guest here with me tonight, which is Connie Chang. Connie is the chair and the treasurer of the Lever Fund, which finds and funds and partners organizations in our area, in the nation's capital region, and really helps families and individuals overcome poverty's multiple interconnected barriers. The Lever Fund is also a sister organization of Robin Hood, and we are absolutely inspired every day by the amazing work that they do. And Connie is also a commissioner of the Advisory Neighborhood Commission for single member districts in Chevy Chase. She's a lifelong DC resident. Excuse me. Her career is focused on the intersection of business and government and technological innovation, and she is someone who leads in every single definition of the word. So, Connie, first, I want to thank you for making time tonight, and thank you for coming to spend time with us tonight.
Well, I'm so happy to be here. I spent a lot of years in grad school, and I also did a little stint of teaching at Georgetown, and so to be in this audience is great. To be a part of this again is really nice. Thank you for having me.
No, it's absolutely my joy, and it's our joy. But before diving into the conversation about philanthropy, you talk about your roots within the area, and that was actually one of the reasons why I think it was so exciting to have you here with us at American. But can you tell a little bit about your journey and how you got involved into this work and why this region became so important?
Well, I'm kind of like you, Wes. There's two places that's deep in my heart. One is where I was born, which is Astoria, Queens. So it's New York City. My father emigrated here to the United States. He was one of, at that point, the Chinese Exclusion Act still took place, so only 105 Chinese immigrants could come to the U.S., and he was one of those. He had a job at the U.S. Army Exchange. He worked there in Taiwan. He was born in China, fled to Taiwan after the Chinese Revolution, and then figured out a way to get this job here in the States and was able to come. And he came, and then 5 years later, married my mother, went back, married my mother, and mother came, and they settled in Astoria, Queens. My father came with $20 in his pocket, but he had an economics degree. And he worked both at the U.S. Army Exchange and then at Standard & Poor's, at the United Nations, and also at Ford Foundation as an economist. And so the QSIP numbers on bonds, he was on that team that created that. And also he was really at the very front end of this whole computer science sort of era that just started, where he convinced Ford Foundation and United Nations, when they were doing their econometric kind of forecasting, to just use computers instead of, like, by hand. And so it went from like a week to like a day or something like that. So he was on that team. But he faced discrimination, and my parents decided to become entrepreneurs, and they had the first retail furniture business in New York City, Manhattan, Chinatown. And so I straddled the living in Chinatown, growing up in Astoria, Queens, but living in Chinatown, staying, being there, watching them build this business, as well as going to school elsewhere. And so this straddling of cultures is something that, I grew up with, speaking Chinese at home, Mandarin Chinese, and then speaking English, at school and everything, and decided that that I really wanted to kind of get out of that space, and went to Massachusetts, went to Wellesley College, studied economics there, all women's college, where Hillary went, Clinton, and then ended up in Wall Street, which is, this is the story a lot of people tell. You're an economics major, you don't know what you want to do next, and Wall Street came recruiting, and it was easy. And I did that job for 3 years. I was a financial analyst on Wall Street for First Boston Corporation. It was the mortgage-backed securities industry when it first started. That was very interesting. But I realized that that is not what I wanted to do in my life. I had the skills, and I took it, and I went to grad school, went to UC San Diego, the School of Global Policy and Strategy, learned a lot about how other countries were fostering their scientists and engineers for innovation. That time it was the whole semiconductor industry. There was a battle there about Japan, beating us, and how can we come back. So I studied that, and then decided that I knew nothing about what the US government was doing. And so went on to more grad school, MIT. But before that was the start of a 13-year career at the Department of Commerce. I worked at the Advanced Technology Program, which was this premier public-private partnership program that Bill Clinton supported. And that is important to the story, because in that program, it was a grant it was not a grant, it was a cooperative agreement program, which meant that we can negotiate with scientists from companies who wanted to apply for money for their new ideas. It was high risk, but also had potential broad-based benefits to the economy. And this was an amazing program. It went on for about 17, 18 years before it was cut, unfortunately. But when I was there early. And what I learned was there's so many people with amazing ideas without capital. And the government was able to come in with that risk capital, and be able, with the process, review and decide on these projects and give them $1 million a year, but they had to put in $1 million a year. So it was cost shared. And so that produced amazing work. And that 13 years of seeing the government do that, seeing all these entrepreneurs starting companies, as well as working within big companies, that left a big mark on me. And I moved forward and worked in IP monetization, and then decided that I wanted to take a little bit of a break. And that was the time when my husband started Lever Fund. He co-founded Lever Fund with Gary Jonas, who was the first managing partner of Venture Philanthropy, and with Anne Marie. God, I'm losing track as I'm speaking here. I'm so sorry, I'm hesitating here. Anne-Marie Habishaw, who was the COO of the Biden America campaign, Obama America campaign, and then worked at OPM, and then was at Bully Pulpit. We also brought in other people from Robinhood, Mark Schwartz. And my husband started NGP Software, which is now NGP Van, and that's the Democratic political software company that fuels all these political campaigns. And when they started this Lever Fund, what they really wanted to do was to see if they could apply this Robinhood model, which is all about the board pays 100% of all the overhead costs. All the donations go straight into helping people, okay, with the organizations that we really wanted to support, high performing, high impact organizations, and to see if that model, and to follow it with metrics, and to understand impact. I think we, at that point in time years ago, maybe a little before our time in a way, because what I realize now is that we did it right. What we did was, we understood that people wanted to understand impact and wanted to trace impact, and that's the trust building. But they also wanted the very kind of one-on-one. It's difficult though. It's been difficult to translate this model in DC. A lot of the funding goes into arts and not into poverty, which is what we're focused on, workforce development. But it started like that, and my transformation, meaning from taking everything I learned in government and trying to apply it into this sector, has really been eye-opening for me. You know, it is a challenge, in fact, and it's something that I've been still learning. I'm still reading, I'm still learning, I'm still talking to people to try to understand what that is. And I'm really, as David Brooks says, I'm on my second mountain, which is I'm really trying to give back as best as I can. And so when you mention the commission work, that's the same sort of thing, giving back to my community in ways that I can give back. But I also wanted to talk to you a little bit later on about the role of the government, which
Yeah.
I think is very important. Very
I I
important.
I I I couldn't agree more, and and I want to actually go into detail also about some of the focus areas, because I think one of the fascinating things that you all have been able to do with the Lever Fund is how exactly do you think about the areas that you go into, the things that you focus on, how you think about metrics, but even before that, I want to come back to your story,
Mm,
because when you've had a chance to see the American economy at work through so many different frames, right? Through the nonprofit, through government, through business, to I mean, like literally seeing how this engine churns from various gears, right?
yes.
When you think about that, the fact that you dive so deeply into this idea and the impact of philanthropy,
Mhm.
what were some of the unique things that you noticed about philanthropy that you did not see in other areas? And how did that go into a thinking about ways that we can use philanthropy in kind of new and unique and creative ways to be able to address some of these large societal challenges?
Well, I think the challenge right now is a lot of, let's say, nonprofits who are funded by philanthropists or charitable organizations. Okay? They really focus on telling the story of the beneficiaries. But we are now engaged in the stakeholder analysis lever fund, and we talked to several people, 17 total right now, of a small group, but a deep conversation. And what we've learned is that it's the it's the donor's journey too. I mean, this is the same thing with programs, right? This, when you try to match an employer and an employee, you try to train people and you match. It's not just the person who's trying to upskill, it is also the company. And you have to have that dialogue. And that's really, I think, the change. It's that when we approach people who are potential, let's say, donors, really our question to them is, do your values match what we want, what we are doing? What are your values? What is your journey? Because we all are on a journey. And if you decide that you want to play that role, okay, and I see it as seed capital. If you want to play that role and you want to seed ideas, what journey are you really on? Because the journey that you're on has everything to do with how we communicate with and how we grow together. So I think a lot of the board members on Lever Fund, a lot of times when we've interacted with grantees, we've gotten so excited. We've sat on their board, we've opened up our network because there's something there about the values, the understanding why are you a part of this endeavor at all. It's not just money, it is about the person, and it's the two together. That's very, very important. In that role, I think we have to really dig a little bit more deeply, I think, in that journey, the donor's journey.
And the donor's journey, and it's interesting because I think philanthropy does become one of these fascinating components where you have multiple stakeholders, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think about it where I tell people I think one of the fascinating things about my job is that no day is going to be the same. Tuesday will look different from Monday. Wednesday will look different from Tuesday. But it's
Hmm.
like, you can start your day with a breakfast with a community partner. And then, go straight from there to a meeting with the mayor, and then go straight from there
Right.
to a lunch with a donor, and then go straight from there to a policy conversation, with other local people about a certain policy or that they want to have changed, and then go do media to talk about, like, it's always all over the place, but you have
Right.
stakeholders who you are then you're then working with.
Right.
And philanthropy is pretty unique in that way, right? Because you have, stakeholders, i.e. things like the donors, stakeholders, i.e. the community, the
Correct.
people who you're trying to impact, stakeholders, i.e., the organizations that are also working to do the work. How do you think about that in a concept of where we're trying to impact a larger societal sectoral change, but knowing that you have an entire mosaic of stakeholders who you then have to bring on and engage in that process?
I think that is the challenge. I think you to know where you sit, in that community, in that mosaic, who is who is interested in the work that you're doing, who is dealing with this problem, who should be who should be tackling the problem. That's really key. It's not just having, capital and having money, but who really should be doing what work. And that's a question that we ask ourselves. It's different in the government. It was very different. You get appropriated money from Congress. You are supposed to carry out the wishes of Congress, and you're supposed to do things. There's a whole process, but you're not really talking to the citizens. I mean, you're in silos in some ways, right? But you're doing your job well. When you're a philanthropist, that's very different. You're very close to the ground. You're closer to the ground, and that is so important, to be close to the ground. And this is why I say not only the donor's journey, but um, and I would say the beneficiary too. You have to know that community well, because you're not finding solutions in a vacuum. Like, policy is policy. Policy debates are about bigger picture, right? Structural movements, things that are changing. But when you're on the ground, you're a practitioner. That's so different. I mean, you really need, and certainly as a commissioner, you have to have your ear to the ground. But this is not easy work. Listening and listening is not easy. Active listening, but then listening for what purpose? How are you going to take this and do what with? So I will say this: there are researchers that are doing a really good job. They're not just doing quantitative work, they're doing qualitative surveys, meaning they are talking to people who would like this service or who are maybe not engaged in the service. And this is workforce development I'm speaking to. And Skills Up is a Skills Up coalition. Put together a study with the Gates Foundation. They got some money to do that, but and this work is not out yet, but they did really good work by talking to the people and asking, why is it that you haven't, like, do you know that this training program is around? Why is it that you haven't taken advantage of it?
Mm.
And getting their input is critical, because when you get input from people who you're trying to uplift, let's say, right, you can't force a solution. You have to figure out the right solution.
Mm.
And so this is a harder job. It's a much harder job on the ground, and I think we still need people, boots on the ground, they say, it is very important to do that. And I think that this is something that we've done well with the organizations that are our grantees. They are very much involved in the community, and they're iterating, they're innovating, and they're creative. They're not like just doing the same thing over and over again. They're really trying to be nimble, I think is the right word. Yeah, and flexible.
And you all have been amazingly deliberate about how do you think about the diversification of portfolios. Where if you think about the past 2 decades, there's been about a 400% increase in philanthropic giving, and this is in philanthropy as a whole. Yet during that same time period, there only about 10% of the dollars have gone to organizations that are led by people of color, and so philanthropy really has had an awakening moment in all this, where there was a time when oftentimes when people talk about bias, they thought they were talking about the private sector or venture capital community or private dollars, and without realizing that philanthropy also had the same measures and the levers of bias that still does exist. How do you all think about, when you think about your portfolio that you support, about how you are lifting up and supporting BIPOC led organizations, and why was that so imperative
Mhm.
for the organization to be able to take that on?
Well, for us, I think we got lucky because of the region. I think who we support look like who they support.
Hmm.
So I don't, a lot of the leaders of these organizations are people of color. Now, the board members may not be. And so I think that with this whole racial reckoning of last year, our communities are going through it. I think that there should be a lot more education on being an anti-racist. I've been involved in conversation with the Anti-Racist Table. This is an organization here in DC, and they've they had a 30-day challenge where you do individual work and then you are a part of a community. And now they're going to kind of spread their wings out and make it not so condensed. The lessons are like 3 times a week, and you can get through it. But what's interesting is we may not think we are, but we are in various ways. And this is hard. This is hard work because no one wants to feel like they're not 100% great, right? Everyone wants to feel great, but we come with lived experiences. We come with our own biases, and it's very important to address it. So what I would like to do, this is something that we're planning, is for our grantee community for them to bring their board and to go through this exercise,
Mm,
because that I think is going to be it's a different way to DEI. It is personal work. We all have to engage in this work. It is very important. And in engaging in this work, everything we see will come through those anti-racist lens. And that is very important. So these are all the things that I think make perhaps it more difficult for organizations, nonprofits to look like who they are serving or partnering with. But I don't think it's for lack of trying. I think it's implicit, sort of under the radar kind of biases that we just don't know yet. And we have to ferret out, and we have to examine, we have to interrogate, and then we have to come to some kind of recognition on our own part, and then we have to live that. So living it is the hardest thing, I think. That's the challenge.
I love that answer. I wanna turn over and open up to PJ because I know we're already getting questions both in the chat and on Facebook, and I want to allocate time. But I did have one more question that I want to ask before I turn it over to PJ.
Mhm.
Um,
Sorry.
there is something about this region, right? There is a dynamism, there's an excitement, there's a diversity. But also, we know that we still do live in a region, and it's not even just in the state of Maryland, but it's also when you incorporate DC, Virginia, and this region, the entire DMV, um, that has amazingly inequitable results. Where we have a place in a region that is one of the wealthiest regions in the wealthiest country in the wealthiest history of the world,
Mhm.
um, and you still have massive disparities. So there's actually a unique role that philanthropy has played, is playing, and will play when it comes to addressing these multitude of opportunities and challenges, these clash that oftentimes takes place within the region. Uh, what about this region do you think, when we talk about, if people say, well, what could we focus on? What are the things that we can get done? What are things that we think philanthropy can uniquely impact within this region? What's your answer?
Well, the image that came to my head was like a leaking pipe, like an old pipe. And we're all just like scurrying and trying to like stop the water,
Mm,
right? And I really think that we need to step back and think about the pipe itself. And no amount, I mean, certainly I don't think our region gives enough to, unlike New York City. I mean, DC, I've been here over 25 years, and it's my second home now. We do not really focus enough attention on poverty, but on the underlying structural issues of poverty, which will never, unfortunately, be addressed by philanthropy. It's going to be addressed unless philanthropy, we change direction and then really promote policies that will address these structural deficits, frankly, that create the problem in the first place. So, we can talk about several issues: home buying, okay, redlining. I mean, these are histories we're living down. These are policy. It's by design that this is what's come to roost, right? So, decades before you have policy, you have you know, we've so many people have fought not to pay taxes. The government doesn't have enough money, let's say, or governments priorities are different, okay, you're going to get these consequences. And philanthropists, we're very generous. People are very generous, but the problems still remain and have gotten worse. So what do? We have to figure out how to direct our attention to solving the underlying problems while we, I'm an economist, marginal benefit, while the marginal benefit of supporting people now, I mean, that's still important. We can't not do that, but we've got to figure out ways. We have to almost have like a trust, a brain trust of people really working on these issues, and getting access to the right people who are going to listen. And, philanthropists, we have to do what I'm doing. I mean, it's hard work, but run for local office, run. Because if you don't engage, that engagement at the local level, okay, at the state level, at the federal level, these all matter. We know this now. And every decision we make locally impacts the people who live here. I mean, I know that for sure now, okay? But unless we're engaged, we're not going to solve these problems. So philanthropy has done good, but it's really been like, like that pipe and the water spurting out and just like trying to hold it on. That's no amount of money will do it. But I will also say this, there's money in donor advised funds that are sitting there. It's like $112 billion that are not being used. So that we have to tap into. We do have to tap into that money, but we have to figure out how to use that money wisely. Seed investments of really good ideas of how to make our country better. And justice, equity, those are hard issues. Those are not easy.
Connie, I love this conversation. It's so spot on, and it's funny. One of the issues. I want to turn to this question, but one of the issues that actually, one of the big issues that we have to address is how people are thinking about and utilizing, donor advised funds. Because you're right. I mean, they're an amazing creation, and this idea that people can actually almost in many ways create like your personal family foundation, your personal targeted asset, and wonderful, and you get the credit for it. But the thing is, you get the credit for it whether you allocate the capital or not.
Correct.
And that has to be addressed.
Come on.
It has to be addressed.
Right. That's policy.
That's right.
That's a law. Okay. Like they've already gotten, you get the benefit already. You get the tax benefit already. But then how long are you going to wait?
That's right.
And what are the incentives for those institutions that house that donor advised funds, or even the community foundation that houses it? What incentive when they collect a fee do they have in dispersing the money? I mean, money can't sit there, right? We have real problems. DC just had a budget surplus. You know how many tweets went out with like, what? We didn't do this and we didn't do that because we were worried about COVID and all this stuff. And now we have this huge budget surplus. People were upset. Why? Because you can use that money to do good. And if money is just sitting there, there's something wrong. There's just something wrong. And that has to be fixed. It really does.
Amen.
Yeah.
PJ, I want to turn it over to you with a huge thank you for all the work that you've done also in preparation for this. So it's great having you on board. Now I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for being here, Mr. Moore, Mr. Chang. So there's been some criticism that philanthropy driven by the wealthy is undemocratic and perpetuates a status quo that maintains the status of the rich and casts them as heroes, while not effectively addressing issues that limit economic mobility. So what are your thoughts on this, and how can this issue be addressed? So can private philanthropy and government programs work in tandem to truly create change?
Well, you brought that up, right, with Rockefeller. I have actually the reference, when Rockefeller in the 1920s, the Rockefellers, I'm reading from this book, which is what this person is quoting. This is Anand's book. Yeah, this is, okay, fantastic. All right.
Yeah, very good book.
So, University of Iowa's Child Welfare Research Station, at that time, they did a study, right? So studies are really, really important. They did a study that said that it's the child's environment, not their genetics, that predicts their future. And that then, it took a long time, but in 1965, Johnson took that on as public policy to say that the nation's poor children will not be poor any longer, and then started up his program. I forget the name now. Anyway, to relieve poverty, to really deal with the environment. So what I'm trying to say here is that it is really important for us as philanthropists not to think that we can solve these problems that government actually can solve at scale. When you have a legislation go out and you've got a budget, that getting that kind of budget and that kind of attention, and the staff to implement, that's really critical. But the work that we do, which Wes, you said, like insights, really digging into the problem, seeing something, but having the channel, that's the connection piece, that mosaic that you talked about. Because you go and you talk to a lot of people, you have a lot more effect, frankly. And that's important, if you're doing the right thing, if you're really on the ground and understanding it. But us seeding these studies, Brookings and other sort of think tanks, but then other researchers like I brought up with Skill Up Coalition, bringing in researchers that have a different point of view that can really add to that kind of understanding to enlighten us, can then lead those kinds of things that we uncover for the government to take up. Because really the government should be solving those problems for all, not just a few philanthropists, dealing with it, I think.
And
It's just democracy. Yeah.
And kind of, I think you are so spot on, because I think when people think about why we have philanthropy, like what is the point of philanthropy, right? The point of philanthropy, and the reason we have it, is because there is some type of breakdown somewhere that's allowing people or entities to fall through cracks, that philanthropy then ends up having to oftentimes play the final catcher, right? The reason that we have poverty fighting organizations is because we allow poverty in our society, right? The reason that we have housing stability initiatives is because we allow housing instability in our society. And so it really does, so Connie's spot on, is by how do we actually create that lever to where this is about not only how are we addressing the final result of the problem, but how are we addressing the problem in the first place? And so to the question, I think about it where I agree, where we should not be celebrating people for what they give away. Right, a person gave away X million this year, or Y million that year, or Y billion that year, and then they receive, to your point, that they get celebrated. But it's really about, what is the problem that they're trying to solve? Why does the problem exist, and how does that philanthropic gift help to fundamentally solve the problem? Where it's like the philanthropic capital should be patient, but it shouldn't be permanent. Because if
Correct.
capital is permanent, it means we're perpetuating and not really attacking the problem.
Exactly. It's getting at root cause, where that's what engineers do. If you have a structural failure, you're not going to just put you're not going to tape over it. You're going to be like, okay, I'm going to look at the whole system. Where did this fail? I mean, the factors really matter. And so, yeah, I think we play a strong role in doing that, but we are not the forever people. We're the temporary keepers, right? And we're the people who are, and there's a question there too. I mean, there's other questions, but we're the temporary people. There are people who want to take action. I came from the government, now I'm not in the government, and now I'm a regular citizen in this community, and I would like to do good, and I see a problem. So you step into it, you take action, but after a while that the problem is too big, and the problem requires a lot more effort, attention, and real solutions, not band-aids. And that's what I hope the Lever Fund will continue to do, after we go through all this, like the stakeholder analysis and understanding our donors, but really understanding what role do we really play in this region, in in putting our attention to the most important things. We only have 24 hours in a day. So, right, there's only so many of us.
Awesome. And then there's another question, which is from Mr. Tony Hollinger in the Washington, D.C. area. He says, does Ms. Chang or Mr. Moore have insight as to why philanthropy in the D.C. area is so heavily weighted towards arts versus alleviating poverty? Is there a misperception that there is insignificant poverty in the nation's capital?
Well, 1 in 4 adults are in 1 in 6 adults are in poverty, and 1 in 4 children. So it's definitely a region that has poverty. I mean, poverty is here. I do not know why. I think that there's big foundations. The arts is big. I mean, part of it is we're the nation's capital. So this is like the distinction you make with people who live in the nation's capital and people who enjoy the nation's capital, or they work here but they go home elsewhere, right? So in the nation's capital, those who live here, the residents, 700,000 of us, there's a substantial number of us who are poor, who are living below the poverty line, and that's unacceptable. But what attracts people to the nation's capital are the arts. You know, we make a lot of investments in the arts. Everything is free. If you go to a different city, the museums are not free. You know, we've got government support. We also have a lot of patrons, and you can question that, but people put in money where they want to, and for them, endowing a university is an important thing because that's important. Putting it in the arts is important. Fighting poverty is an important issue, but not important perhaps to the philanthropists enough here. Maybe it is too difficult of a problem, you know, too hard of a problem. I don't know the answer. But I think this is where we have to ferret that out and try to understand it better.
It's 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 interesting because we oftentimes think about that too, where whether you're talking about the Lever Fund or Robin Hood or Tipping Point or Slingshot
Right.
or the
A better
Constellation
Chicago,
or
right?
Better Chicago, places who are very deliberate and intentional about focusing on poverty. And it's like you think about the philanthropists who will support our organization. These are people who are probably getting, hit by 15 different organizations a week to try to support them. And so how people choose what it is they choose to support
Right.
it's really complicated. I tell you that one is I think arts and history and culture actually do play a very important role when it comes to societal build. I actually think that having an honest arts framework, an honest history framework, an honest cultural framework is actually one of the best things that we can do psychologically, also to just both build children and also build community. I do also know these two things though, and I think Connie touched on a really important point. One is the fact that our work, by definition, it's hard. Oftentimes when people are thinking about philanthropy, the truth is, and the natural human instinct is to revert to something that is easier, you can see a tangible benefit right now. Like I can
Correct.
see a tangible benefit from what I'm doing. A building went up, right?
Yeah.
A new exhibit is being displayed. That's a tangible, immediate relief that I can see where my capital goes. Saying that we are focusing on poverty, you're not going to get that immediate relief in the same way. So it is a much more complicated argument to make. The second piece that I do think is important, though, is it goes back to what we we're talking about before, where oftentimes nonprofits there's a blanket benefit to how we think about nonprofits, and that's what I was saying before. When we look at kind of like that $700 billion number, and
Mm,
some of it goes to that money being donated to Yale gets the same benefit as that money that's being donated to a soup kitchen. That's the way the code looks at it. And so one of the things we think we do have to also think about is
right.
how are we evaluating where capital goes? Because right now there's a pretty blanket understanding about what it means to be generous and how it is viewed, that I think there needs to be there should be a functional and fundamental understanding that it might be time for a conversation around those things.
Yeah, incentives, incentivizing, you know, a system of incentives is very important. I mean, this is in the technology world, you know, we often were, when I was in this advanced technology program, it was like, well, why are we going to give you money to give away? Why don't we just do an R&E, research and experimentation tax credit? Well, because that's a blunt instrument versus a finer instrument, right? And so incentivizing donors, philanthropists, you know, 70%, I think, of the number of philanthropists are individual philanthropists. You know, people do give, but to be able to incentivize them to give to certain, like maybe certain themes, certain issues, maybe that's a way to do it. I don't know, for a period of time. We have to think through this. Can we do that? Will we have support doing it? It's not just here's a better solution, but can you get support for that better solution? This is harder to do, but it is more democratic. And it is something where you put all your heads together to try to figure out that this is not happening. Poverty is not, dealing with poverty is not like, it's not like a feel good. It feels good when you lift someone out of poverty, but the issue is so big. It's hard. I think it's a harder sell. But if you incentivize it, then that's different. I think you get a bigger bang. For this kind of public spirit that you have would be really nice.
Awesome. And then one final kind of question briefly is directed to Ms. Chang is what is one piece of advice you would have for someone who maybe wants to go into a similar line of work as you?
Oh my God, come talk to me. Come talk to me now. Yes, I want you to, please, if you're interested, come. I'm not someone who has all the answers. I want ideas. I would love for young people to join. I think, this is so important, to teach our children, definitely children and families who are privileged, okay, which is what I teach my children, okay. You get something, you should think about not just yourself, but the people around you and your broader community. This is very important. And that kind of philosophy, those values you instill in the younger generation. If you're interested, come see me, bring friends. I will treat you, okay, give you lunch, have a conversation, introduce you to people, open my door. Please do it, okay? The more interested you are, if you're just even a little bit curious, come talk to me. Someone will give you my email. Really, I'm totally open to that. That would make me feel so good. Really.
Connie, did you just offer free lunch to college
Yes,
students?
yes, I did. I'm okay with that. Yes, people need to eat. And I got Little Sesame here, has got great hummus right here where I live, Connecticut Avenue over here. If you're in California, I don't know, maybe I'll have to call, but please contact me. I would love to hear from you.
Connie, you continue to be such an inspiration to me, to our entire field. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You're too kind. Thank you so much, Wes. It's so nice to be in conversation with you.
Always, always, and always, and any time. I'm so grateful. So grateful to you. So grateful. And PJ, we're so grateful to you, man. Well done. Well done. And thank you for all of your work. And to all of you, thank you for joining us for session 3. And please join us for our next conversation, which will be taking place on March 16th. Same time, 5:30 to 6:30. And the next one we're going to focus on is going to be the business case for economic mobility, where we're really going to focus on why should economic justice be a business imperative? What does it mean by inclusive growth and conscious capitalism? Why is it that this conversation must include our business community as well? So to all of you for joining tonight, to all of you for joining us on stage tonight, thank you so much. Bless you all. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. It's great to see you.